Everyone in Ellingford knew the Duke had ignored Lady Henrietta for years. They whispered about it in the corners of ballroom floors, murmured it behind silk fans, and wondered what a woman of such grace had ever done to deserve such absolute coldness from her oldest friend. But the truth was simpler and far more devastating. The Duke didn't ignore her because he despised her. He ignored her because the moment another man began to court her, the moment the Earl of Harrowcroft dared to bow over her hand, something inside him shattered. He watched her with a stiffness no one could interpret, following her with eyes he once refused to meet, terrified by the realization that the woman he had pushed away for her own safety was finally slipping beyond his reach. This is the story of a man who spent years pretending she meant nothing, only to discover she was the only thing that mattered. To understand the silence, one must understand the bond that came before it. 16 years ago, before he was the cold, distant Duke of Ellingford, he was simply Albinus. He had inherited the title at 15, a boy forced to become a man overnight when his father passed, standing in the grand hall of his estate with the weight of a legacy crushing his shoulders. He was already striking even then, with impeccable auburn hair styled in a deep side part and piercing light blue eyes that seemed to see too much. He looked out the window at the vast lands of Ellingford, and just across the river he saw the neighbouring estate of Pembroke Hall. The two families had been allies for generations, dining together every Sunday, ruling their lands side by side as equals. Albinus assumed that friendship would last forever, never suspecting that a silence was about to fall over the house next door that would change his life irrevocably. The tragedy struck in 1802. News arrived at dawn that a carriage accident had claimed the lives of Lord and Lady Pembroke, plunging the great house next door into darkness and leaving their sole heiress entirely alone. Lady Henrietta was only 9 years old, and while she was one of the wealthiest heiresses in England, her fortune could offer no comfort in her grief. There was never a question of where she would go. Albinus's mother, the Dowager Duchess, didn't wait for the courts or the lawyers. She simply took the family carriage to Pembroke Hall and brought the child home. Henrietta didn't arrive in rags. She stepped out of the carriage wearing the finest black silk, clutching a silver hairbrush her mother had given her, looking every bit the miniature aristocrat. But when she looked up at the imposing doors of Ellingford Manor, the terror in her eyes betrayed her bravery. Albinus stood at the top of the stairs, 16 years old, and already learning to mask his emotions behind a facade of nobility. But when he saw the little girl, he had watched play in the gardens since she was a baby, standing there stiff and trying not to cry, he broke every rule of protocol. He walked down the stone steps, ignoring the servants, and knelt directly in front of her. He didn't bow to her like a visiting lady. He looked her in the eye, his sharp, clean-shaven jaw set with determination. "Your lands are safe, Henrietta," he promised, his voice steady and low. "Your home is safe, and you are family here." She didn't curtsy. She simply stepped forward and buried her face in his coat, and Albinus, the boy who had sworn to be strong, wrapped his arms around her, becoming her guardian, her hero, and her world in a single heartbeat. For nearly a decade, they were inseparable. They were more than neighbors. They were a team, managing their adjoining estates side by side as she grew from a grieving child into a formidable young woman. She adored him, measuring every other man against his standard and finding them all lacking. Albinus, for his part, watched her with a fierce, protective pride. He viewed her as a sister, a sacred trust he had to shield from the harshness of the world. He managed her fortune, taught her to ride, and let her sit in his library while he worked, never once crossing the line of propriety. He loved her, but it was a safe, familial love, until the summer she turned 18, and everything changed. It was the eve of her debut in 1811. Henrietta walked into his study to show him her gown for the season, a vision in white silk cut low in the current fashion, signaling to the world that she was no longer a child, but a woman ready for marriage. She spun in a slow circle, smiling, asking if she looked ready, if she looked like a lady. Albinus looked up from his desk, the firelight catching the sharp angles of his face and the striking blue of his eyes. He opened his mouth to offer a brotherly compliment, but the words died in his throat. His heart hammered a rhythm against his ribs that terrified him because he didn't see the neighbor next door or the ward he had raised. He saw a woman, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt a jolt of desire so powerful it made him want to burn the world down just to keep her. Panic flooded his veins, cold and sharp. The thought sickened him. He was her guardian, 7 years her senior, the man trusted to protect her innocence. He felt like a predator, convinced that if he showed her even an ounce of what he was feeling, he would corrupt her. He believed the only way to save her from his own immoral desire was to make sure she never came near him again. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, his face hardening into a mask of ice. He forced his eyes to go dead, looking at the woman he loved with calculated disdain. "You look inappropriate, Henrietta," he lied, his voice cutting through the room. "Cover yourself." The smile fell from her face as if she had been slapped, and Albinus turned his back on her, staring at the wall with shaking hands, knowing he had just broken her heart to save her soul. Albinus didn't just close a door that night in 1811, he severed a lifeline. When Henrietta came down to breakfast the morning after he had called her inappropriate, seeking even a flicker of the warmth she had known for a decade, she found the room possessed by a stranger. Albinus sat at the head of the table, his impeccable auburn hair catching the morning light and his sharp, clean-shaven jaw set like granite, reading his newspaper as if she were a ghost. When she greeted him, desperate to bridge the sudden chasm between them, he didn't even look up to meet her eyes. He simply turned a page and greeted her as Lady Henrietta, stripping away the name Hattie that had been hers since childhood. In that single polite utterance, the bond between them hardened into something cold and quietly unbearable. As the seasons turned, so did the nature of their distance. Henrietta went to her debut season in London that year with a heavy heart, forcing smiles for viscounts she did not know, while Albinus remained in the country, telling himself that his solitude was a noble sacrifice. He convinced himself that by removing his dark, immoral desire from her path, he was setting her free to find a husband worthy of her innocence. Someone light, someone safe, someone who didn't look at her with the starving hunger he felt clawing at his chest. But he had miscalculated the depth of her loyalty. She returned from London unmarried, confusing the ton and rejecting suitors, simply because she was waiting for the Duke to remember who they were to each other. Time did not heal the space between them, it widened it. The summers they used to spend riding the boundary lines of their estates became solitary processions. Henrietta learned to ride alone, galloping over the hills until her lungs burned, never knowing that Albinus watched her from the high window of his study, his hand pressed against the glass and his light blue eyes squeezed shut in physical pain, denying himself the only sight he truly craved. Even their dinners became a theatre of silence, the air thick with unsaid words, the clinking of silver against china, the only sound in a room screaming with tension. She stopped asking about his day. She stopped knocking on his door. Slowly, painfully, she learned the cruelest lesson of all, that the person you love can be sitting right in front of you and still be thousands of miles away. By the spring of 1817, whatever warmth he once showed had vanished entirely. Henrietta was 24 now, dangerously close to spinsterhood by the unforgiving standards of society, but she possessed a cool, detached elegance born of 6 years of rejection. One rainy afternoon, she sat at her vanity staring at her reflection, and the realization finally settled in her chest. She had wasted her entire youth mourning a man who was still alive. She dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and made a silent vow to the empty room. She was done waiting for a ghost. She was ready to marry, not for love, because her heart still belonged to the fool next door, but for a future. She didn't know it yet, but the universe was about to answer her resignation with a storm. Downstairs, the heavy brass knocker of the front door slammed against the wood, announcing a visitor who would shatter the stalemate forever. A carriage had arrived bearing a crest that did not belong to the Pilkingtons or the Pembrokes. Out stepped Felix, the Earl of Harrowcroft, a man who possessed charm, debts he needed to pay with a rich wife's fortune, and absolutely no fear of the Duke. He walked into the foyer with a smile that promised trouble, and for the first time in 6 years, the Duke of Ellingford was about to realize that his noble sacrifice had a terrible price. He had spent so much time protecting Henrietta from himself that he had forgotten to protect her from everyone else. The Duke's study, Pilkington House, spring, 1817. Albinus sat behind his massive mahogany desk, staring at a ledger he hadn't turned the page of in 20 minutes. To the outside world, he was the picture of aristocratic composure, his impeccable auburn hair swept back with a deep part, his clean-shaven jaw set in a line of bored indifference, and his striking light blue eyes focused on business. But Henry Ashcombe, his oldest friend, and the only man who dared to speak the truth to him, wasn't fooled by the mask. Henry swirled his brandy, leaning against the mantel, watching the Duke pretend to work until the silence became too loud to ignore. "How long do you intend to keep this up, Albinus?" Henry asked, his voice cutting through the quiet of the room. Albinus didn't look up, dipping his quill into the inkwell with deliberate slowness. "I do not know what you mean." "The act," Henry clarified, stepping closer to the desk, his expression hardening. "The stoic guardian, the indifferent neighbor. You have played this role for 6 years, suffering in silence. But she is 24 now. Harrowcroft is courting her openly. He is not a boy, Albinus. He is a man with debts and a title, and he is charming her right out from under your nose." Albinus gripped his quill tighter until the feather snapped, but his voice remained flat, terrified to admit the truth even to himself. "Then let him have her. Henrietta is a child to me, Henry, a sister. I raised her. To think of her as anything else would be depraved." Henry slammed his glass down on the table, the sound echoing in the large room like a gunshot. "She is not a child. She is a woman who thinks you despise her. If you do not tell her how you feel, if you do not drop this absurd shield of propriety, you are going to lose her. And you won't lose her to a scandal, Albinus. You will lose her to a silence you created." Albinus finally looked up, locking eyes with his friend, his light blue eyes flashing with a dangerous mix of anger and panic. "I keep my distance to save her, Henry. If Harrowcroft can give her a normal life, a life without the shadow of a guardian looming over her, then I will not stand in his way." But saying he would stand aside was one thing. Watching it happen was a torture he had not prepared for. The Assembly Rooms, Hertfordshire. 2 nights later, the reality of his decision walked through the doors of the local assembly rooms. Under the glare of the crystal chandeliers, Henrietta entered on the arm of Felix, the Earl of Harrowcroft. She looked breathtaking, her dark hair pinned up with pearls, but it was the smile on her face that stopped Albinus's heart. It was polite, practiced, and utterly devoid of the joy she used to show him. Felix leaned in close, whispering something in her ear that made her blush, and for the first time, Albinus saw a hand resting on her waist that wasn't his own. The room seemed to tilt. Albinus stood by the wall, gripping his glass until the stem threatened to snap. He watched Felix maneuver her through the crowd with the slick, predatory grace of a man who knows the value of a prize but not the worth of a soul. Every instinct Albinus had buried for 6 years roared to life, screaming at him to cross the floor, to tear Felix's hand away, to claim what he had foolishly told himself he didn't want. He realized with sickening clarity that his noble sacrifice was backfiring. He hadn't protected her from the world. He had simply left her vulnerable to the first wolf who knew how to smile. By midnight, the suffocating heat of the ballroom forced him out onto the stone terrace, but the cool night air did nothing to douse the fire in his chest. He gripped the balustrade, staring out into the dark gardens, trying to regulate his breathing until the sound of footsteps behind him announced he wasn't alone. Henry Ashcombe stepped up beside him, his voice devoid of its usual humor. "You are a terrible liar, Albinus," Henry said quietly. "You say she is a sister. You say she is a child."
Okay, Andy.
Henry turned, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that cut through the silence. "But I watched you tonight. You did not look at her like a brother. You looked at her like a man watching his own house burn down." Albinus closed his eyes, the image of Henrietta laughing at Felix's joke searing into his mind, realizing he could no longer hide behind his duty. "It is too late, Henry," he whispered, the mask finally cracking to reveal the devastation underneath. "I pushed her away too hard. She isn't just indifferent to me, she thinks I despise her." The morning room, Pembroke Hall, the day after the ball. The morning sun did little to warm the chill in Henrietta's heart as she paced the length of her own drawing room. She had fled Ellingford Manor 3 years ago to escape the Duke's coldness, hoping that distance would cure her heart, but last night's ball proved that even walls and rivers could not protect her. Kitty Farewell sat on the velvet settee, pouring tea with a sharpness that matched her tongue. When Henrietta confessed that she felt nothing when the Earl touched her, that she only felt the heavy, burning gaze of Albinus across the room, Kitty set her cup down with a clatter. "You are starving yourself for a statue, Hattie," Kitty said, her voice firm but laced with pity. "Albinus has ignored you for 6 years. He watched you debut and said nothing. He watched you cry and did nothing." Kitty stood up, taking Henrietta's cold hands in hers. "Felix offers you a home. He offers you children. He offers you a life where you aren't waiting for a ghost to haunt you. Marry the Earl. Forget the Duke." And for the first time in a decade, Henrietta stopped arguing. She looked at her empty house, and she nodded. The back streets of London, 3 days later. While Henrietta was resigning herself to a loveless marriage, Albinus was tearing London apart to stop it. He had ridden to the city in a fury, driven by a dark suspicion that Felix's charm was a veneer for something rotten. For 3 days, the Duke of Ellingford did not sleep. He moved through the smoky backrooms of banks and the dimly lit gaming hells of St. James, his usually impeccable auburn hair windblown and his sharp, clean-shaven jaw clenched in exhaustion. With Henry Ashcombe at his side, the truth was not hard to find. It was written in red ink across ledgers all over the city. Felix, the Earl of Harrowcroft, was not just a charmer. He was destitute. He had mortgaged his estate to the hilt. His gambling debts were astronomical, and the creditors were circling like sharks. As Albinus stared at the final promissory note, his striking light blue eyes darkened with a protective rage. Felix didn't want Henrietta's heart. He wanted the Pembroke fortune to save himself from ruin. Albinus finally had the weapon he needed. He wasn't just a jealous man anymore, he was her guardian again. The library, Pembroke Hall, the confrontation. He rode back to Hertfordshire that very afternoon, storming into Pembroke Hall without waiting to be announced. He found Henrietta in the library, the very room where they used to read together as children before the silence fell, and he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He threw the sheaf of papers detailing Felix's debts onto the table between them, the sound shattering the quiet of the room. "He is a fraud, Henrietta," Albinus declared, his voice rough with the urgency of the ride. "He does not love you. He loves your inheritance. Look at the debts. He is drowning, and he intends to use you as his raft." He took a step closer, looming over her, his blue eyes pleading with her to see reason. "I forbid you to see him. I will not let you throw your life away on a fortune hunter." He expected tears. He expected her to be horrified. He did not expect the laugh, a cold, broken sound that stopped him dead in his tracks. Henrietta didn't even glance at the papers. She looked up at his handsome, familiar face and found only exhaustion. "You forbid me?" she asked quietly, the dangerous silence stretching between them. "You, who have not spoken a kind word to me in 6 years. You, who turned your face away when I sought your approval." She took a step forward, closing the distance until she was staring up into the eyes she had worshipped for a decade. "You pushed me away, Albinus. You turned your back on me. You made me feel small and unwanted. You resigned your position as my guardian the day you decided I wasn't worth your time." Her voice cracked, tears finally spilling over, but she didn't look away. "You do not get to protect me now. You are not my father, and you are certainly not my husband." The road between Pembroke Hall and Pilkington House. Moments later. Albinus didn't just ride away from Pembroke Hall, he fled the wreckage of his own making. He spurred his horse into a gallop, the thunder of hooves matching the frantic rhythm of his heart, but he couldn't outrun the echo of Henrietta's voice. "You are not my father." The words sliced through the cool air, dismantling the armor he had worn for 6 years. He had ridden there to be her savior, armed with evidence and righteousness. Instead, she had looked at him not with gratitude, but with the exhausted eyes of a woman who had spent a decade screaming into a void. He realized, with a sickening lurch in his stomach, that to her he wasn't the hero protecting her from a fortune hunter. He was the villain who had abandoned her. The library, Pilkington House, late afternoon. He stormed into his library, stripping off his gloves and throwing them into the dying embers of the fireplace. He poured a brandy with shaking hands, spilling amber liquid onto the mahogany desk, and drank it in one burning gulp. He caught his reflection in the dark glass of the window, impeccable auburn hair now disheveled from the wind, a sharp, clean-shaven jaw clenched tight enough to snap, and striking light blue eyes that looked wild and haunted. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire life shatter on the floor. Henry Ashcombe found him there 10 minutes later, staring into the empty glass. Henry didn't ask what happened. The devastation in the room was answer enough. "She refused to listen," Henry asked quietly, closing the heavy oak doors to shut out the world. "She listened," Albinus rasped, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. He didn't turn around. "She told me I had no right. She told me I resigned my position as her guardian the day I decided she wasn't worth my time." He laughed, a harsh, broken sound that terrified his friend. "She thinks I ignored her because I didn't care, Henry. She thinks I pulled away because she was a burden I wanted to be rid of." Albinus turned, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I let her move out, Henry. 3 years ago, when she turned 21, she packed her trunks and moved back to an empty house just to get away from me. And I let her go. I stood in the doorway and watched her carriage leave because I thought if she was out of my house, I would stop wanting her. I was wrong. I see her empty room every day, and it feels like a tomb." Henry walked over and took the glass from Albinus's hand before he could crush it. "Then tell her," Henry said sharply. "Stop being a martyr, Albinus. Go back there and tell her the truth." "I cannot," Albinus roared, the control finally snapping. He began to pace the room, a caged animal. "Tell her what? That I stopped speaking to her because I wanted to touch her? That I ignored her because every time she walked into a room, I felt like a sinner?" He stopped, running a hand through his hair, destroying the perfect part. "She was 18 when it started, Henry. She was innocent. She looked at me like I was a god, and I looked at her like a man starving to death. I pulled away to protect her from me. I thought if I was cold, she would stay pure." He slumped against the desk, the fight draining out of him. "I never courted anyone else because no one compared. I have spent 6 years in hell, telling myself I was noble, and all I did was make her feel unloved." Henry stared at his friend, finally seeing the full scope of the tragedy. Albinus hadn't acted out of malice. He had acted out of a warped, overwhelming sense of honor. "You fool," Henry said, his voice low and urgent. "You didn't save her. You just handed her to a man who will use her. Felix will propose by the end of the week. If you do not claim her now, you will watch her walk down the aisle with a man who only wants her money. Is your pride worth that?" The long walk. The hallway of Pilkington House. Evening. Leaving Henry Ashcombe in the library with the ruins of the brandy bottle, Albinus stepped out into the corridor. The hallway of Pilkington House was vast, lined with the portraits of his ancestors, men who had ruled this county with iron fists and cold hearts. For 6 years, Albinus had walked these halls trying to be like them. He had modeled his silence on his grandfather. He had modeled his stoicism on his father. He had believed that to be a good duke, he had to be a statue. But tonight, as he walked toward the family wing, his boots echoing heavily on the marble, he realized that the statues were just cold stone, and he was a man burning alive. He was going to see the one person whose judgment he feared almost as much as Henrietta's, his mother, the Dowager Duchess. Lady Pilkington was the spine of the family, a woman who valued reputation, propriety, and duty above breathing. Albinus was convinced that she would look at his disheveled state and despise him, not for losing the girl, but for losing his composure. He stopped outside her double doors, smoothing his hands down his ruined coat, trying to summon the ghost of the dignity he had worn for a decade. But his hands were shaking, the mask was gone. He pushed the doors open and walked in to face his judgment. The sanctuary, the Dowager's private drawing room. The room was warm, smelling of lavender and wood smoke, a sharp contrast to the frozen tomb of Albinus's library. Lady Pilkington sat by the fire in her high-backed velvet chair, her silver needle flashing in the firelight as she worked on an intricate embroidery hoop. She was a woman of precise movements and guarded emotions, a true matriarch of the Regency. She didn't look up immediately. "You are late for dinner, Albinus," she said, her tone clipped and conversational. "Henderson tells me you have been in London for 3 days. I expected you to—" She looked up. The sentence died in her throat. The needle froze in mid-air. Lady Pilkington stared at her son, her eyes widening in genuine shock. She had not seen him look this undone since the morning his father died 16 years ago. Albinus stood in the center of the Persian rug, a portrait of devastation. His impeccable auburn hair, usually styled with a severe, perfect deep side part, was wild and raked through by desperate fingers. His cravat was loose, but it was his face that frightened her. His sharp, clean-shaven jaw was clenched so tight a muscle jumped beneath the skin, and his striking light blue eyes were red-rimmed, hollowed out by grief. He didn't bow, he didn't offer a formal greeting. He simply walked to the hearth and gripped the white marble mantelpiece as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. "I have lost her, Mother," he said. His voice was unrecognizable, cracked, raw, and stripped of all nobility. Lady Pilkington set her embroidery down slowly, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "Henrietta?" she asked softly. Albinus nodded, staring into the flames. "I tried to save her," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of misery. "I went to London. I found the proofs. Harrowcroft is bankrupt, Mother. He is a fraud. He has mortgages on every inch of his land. I rode to Pembroke Hall to warn her. I threw the evidence on the table. I told her I forbid it." He let out a harsh, dry laugh that sounded like a sob. "She threw me out. She told me I wasn't her father. She told me I wasn't her guardian anymore." He turned to look at his mother, bracing himself for the lecture. "She is going to marry him. She is going to tie herself to a fortune hunter because she hates me. And it is entirely my fault." He waited. He waited for the Dowager to tell him that this was the consequence of emotion. He waited for her to tell him that Henrietta must marry for duty, or that he had done the right thing by keeping his distance all these years to avoid the impropriety of courting his own ward. Instead, the room filled with a silence so profound it hurt. The only sound was the crackle of the logs and the ticking of the clock on the mantel. "You love her," his mother said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a sudden, dawning realization that seemed to knock the wind out of her. Albinus looked down, ashamed of the desire he had fought so hard to bury. "I stayed away to protect her," he confessed brokenly. I thought you would be ashamed. I was her guardian. I was 10 years her senior. I thought if I courted her, I would be taking advantage of my position. I thought I was saving the family from a scandal." Lady Pilkington stood up. And then she did something Albinus had never seen in his 31 years of life. The Dowager Duchess began to cry. It wasn't a polite, aristocratic tear dabbed away with a lace handkerchief. It was a sob of pure, frustrated rage. She walked over to her son, grabbing the lapels of his ruined coat, and shook him. "You foolish, noble idiot boy," she whispered, her voice shaking with emotion. Albinus blinked, stunned. "Mother!" "I thought you disliked her," she cried, her composure shattering. "For 6 years, Albinus. For 6 years I watched you leave rooms when she entered. I watched you speak to her in ice. I watched you ignore her at breakfast, at dinner, at Christmas. I thought you found her annoying. I thought you resented having to raise another man's child." She let go of him, stepping back and throwing her hands up in the air. "I loved her like a daughter the moment I brought her into this house. I have spent every night for the last 6 years praying that you would wake up and see what was right in front of you. But you were so cold. I didn't say anything because I thought your heart was closed to her. I didn't want to force a marriage on you if you didn't love her." The weight of the confession staggered him. Albinus felt the room tilt. All those years of torture, all those nights hiding in his study, all those moments telling himself he was fighting a holy war for his family's honor. "You mean—" Albinus started, his voice barely a whisper, the hope painful in his chest. "You mean you would have blessed it?" "Blessed it?" His mother looked at him incredulously, wiping her eyes with a fierce determination. "Albinus, I would have planned the wedding myself 6 years ago. She is Henrietta. She is family. She is the only woman I have ever seen make you smile." She stepped closer again, her voice dropping to a fierce maternal whisper. "She is half of your soul. And we have all just been standing here, watching you starve yourself." The Grand Foyer, Pilkington House, moments later. Albinus did not walk out of his mother's drawing room. He erupted from it. The blessing of the Dowager Duchess had acted like a match thrown into a powder keg, igniting 6 years of suppressed desire, guilt, and agony in a single blinding flash. For over 2,000 days, he had convinced himself that his inaction was a form of nobility, that by denying himself the woman he loved, he was protecting her soul. But his mother's tears had washed away that lie, leaving only the stark, terrifying truth. He had been a coward, and while he had been playing the martyr, another man had been stealing his life. He stormed down the grand staircase of Pilkington House, taking the marble steps 2 at a time, a reckless urgency in his movement that terrified the staff. The butler, Mr. Henderson, who had served the Pilkington family for 40 years and had never seen the Duke with a hair out of place, pressed himself against the wainscoting, eyes wide. Albinus looked like a man possessed. His impeccable auburn hair, usually styled with that severe, perfect side part, was wild and falling into his eyes. His cravat was undone. His sharp, clean-shaven jaw was set in a rictus of determination that looked less like hope and more like war. "Your Grace?" Henderson stammered, reaching for the Duke's heavy riding coat. "Shall I call for the carriage? It is raining, sir." "No carriage," Albinus barked, his voice echoing off the high-vaulted ceiling. He didn't stop moving. He didn't wait for a hat. He didn't wait for gloves. He threw open the heavy oak front doors himself, the iron hinges groaning in protest. The night air hit him like a physical blow, cold, damp, and smelling of wet earth, but it couldn't touch the fever burning beneath his skin. He had spent a decade being a statue. Tonight, he was a man. The fields between Pilkington House and Pembroke Hall. He bypassed the stables entirely, grabbing the reins of the black stallion that had been saddled for the groom. He swung onto the animal's back with a violence that made the horse rear, fighting for control with a strength born of desperation. He didn't take the road. The road was too slow. The road was for visitors and gentlemen. Albinus turned the horse toward the river, toward the dark expanse of fields that separated his land from hers, and dug his heels in. The ride was a blur of darkness and thunder. Mud flew up in thick, heavy clods, spattering his polished boots and ruining his trousers, but Albinus didn't feel it. The wind whipped his face, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. In his mind, he was rehearsing the words he should have said 6 years ago. The confession was pouring out of him in a disjointed, frantic internal monologue. "I will tell her about the dress," he thought, urging the horse faster as they cleared the stone wall. "I will tell her that I didn't reject her because she was inappropriate. I will tell her that when she walked into my library in that white silk, I had to grip the desk to keep from falling to my knees." He would tell her about the nights he spent standing at his window, watching the lights of Pembroke Hall, drinking brandy, until the image of her face faded enough to let him sleep. He would tell her that he had investigated Felix not to control her, but because the thought of anyone hurting her made him want to burn the world down. He would beg. He, the Duke of Ellingford, who had never bowed to anyone, would get on his knees in the mud and beg her to forgive him. "Just let me be in time," he prayed to a god he hadn't spoken to in years. "Do not let her sign. Do not let her say yes. Give me 10 minutes. Just give me 10 minutes to undo 6 years of silence." The lights of Pembroke Hall appeared through the trees, glowing like a beacon in the mist. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic rhythm of Henrietta, Henrietta, Henrietta. He wasn't the guardian anymore. He wasn't the neighbor. He was a drowning man, and she was the only shore. The arrival. The gates of Pembroke Hall. He didn't slow down as he approached the iron gates. He guided the horse through the open pillars and thundered up the gravel drive, the sound of hooves shattering the quiet elegance of the estate. He pulled the horse to a sliding halt at the foot of the stone steps, the animal blowing hard, steam rising from its flanks in the cool night air. Albinus slid from the saddle, his legs nearly buckling as his boots hit the ground. He was breathless, disheveled, and wild-eyed, a stark contrast to the composed aristocrat who had ruled this county for a decade. He looked up at the massive front doors of Pembroke Hall, the house he had let her move back to, the house he had abandoned her in. He took a step forward, his hand raising to pound on the wood, to wake the house, to demand an audience. But his fist never made contact. Before he could touch the wood, the latch clicked. The heavy door swung inward. Albinus froze, his breath catching in his throat. He expected a butler. He expected a maid. In his wildest hopes, he expected Henrietta, perhaps drawn by the sound of the horse, coming to see who had arrived in such a fury. He was not met by Henrietta. He was met by a wall of smug satisfaction wrapped in a velvet coat. Felix, the Earl of Harrowcroft, stood on the threshold. The contrast between the two men could not have been more devastating. Albinus stood in the rain, mud splattered, breathing hard, his light blue eyes wide with panic, his auburn hair plastered to his forehead. Felix stood under the shelter of the portico, dry, warm, and impeccably dressed. He was adjusting his cuffs, a small self-satisfied smile playing on his lips as he looked down at the Duke. "Leaving so soon, Your Grace," Albinus snarled, the words tearing out of his throat. He stepped into the light of the carriage lamps, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Get away from her house, Harrowcroft. You are not welcome here." Felix didn't flinch. He didn't look intimidated by the fury of one of the most powerful men in England. Instead, he chuckled, a low, dark sound that scraped against Albinus's nerves. "On the contrary, Pilkington," Felix said smoothly, descending one step, placing himself physically between the Duke and the door. "I am very welcome. In fact, I would say I am the most welcome guest this house has seen in years." Albinus took a threatening step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous, vibrating growl. "I know about the debts, Felix. I know about the mortgages. I know you are here to steal her fortune because you have squandered your own. If you think I will let you walk back in there and manipulate her—" "Manipulate?" Felix interrupted, his eyebrows raising in mock surprise. He stopped on the bottom step, standing toe-to-toe with Albinus, his voice dropping to a harsh, mocking whisper. "I am not blind, old man. Do you think I cannot see it? The world seemed to stop spinning. The wind died in the trees. "What are you talking about?" "You love her," Felix said, the words dripping with disdain. "Even a blind man could see it. The way you watch her across the ballroom. The way you stormed in here with your ledgers, trying to scare me off like a jealous dog guarding a bone." Albinus felt the air leave his lungs. He opened his mouth to deny it, but Felix cut him off, stepping closer, his voice sharpening. "You had her all her life, Pilkington," Felix hissed, his eyes hard. "She told me everything. She told me about her parents dying in that carriage. She told me how your family took her in. She told me you were her hero." Felix laughed, shaking his head with genuine pity. "You had 15 years to make her yours. You had every advantage. You had her heart in the palm of your hand since she was 9 years old." Felix straightened his coat, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from his lapel. "But you hesitated. You were too busy being noble to be a man." "And while you were waiting?" I asked. Albinus stared at him, the truth crashing over him like a wave. "She accepted you." "She accepted," Felix confirmed, his eyes glinting with malice. "We are to be married in the spring. You are too late, Duke. You had a decade. I only needed a month." Felix walked past the Duke toward his own horse, which was tethered by the gate. He mounted, gathering the reins, and looked down at Albinus one last time. "She told me you were her guardian. Well, she doesn't need a guardian anymore. She needs a husband, and she chose me." Felix rode away into the night, the sound of his horse fading into the darkness. Albinus stood alone in the driveway of Pembroke Hall. The rain began to fall harder, soaking through his shirt, mixing with the mud on his boots. He looked up at the house. The light in the drawing-room window was still on. He could see a shadow move across the curtain, a silhouette he would know anywhere. It was Henrietta. She was there. She was just on the other side of that door. He could go in. He could pound on the wood. He could scream the truth until she heard him. But the weight of Felix's words anchored him to the ground. "You had her all her life." It was true. He had wasted years on silence, while Felix had simply walked in and asked the question Albinus was too afraid to speak. He had broken his rules. He had raced through the dark. He had finally found the courage to face his own heart. But the Earl was right. He wasn't just late. He was a ghost haunting a life she had already decided to leave behind. Albinus turned back to his horse, his movements slow and old. He didn't mount immediately. He leaned his forehead against the wet saddle leather, and for the first time since he was 15 years old, he let a sound escape his throat that was not a word, but a sob. The morning after. The master bedroom. Pilkington House. Dawn. The sun rose over Hertfordshire, grey and weeping, matching the silence that had settled like dust inside Pilkington House. Albinus had not slept. He sat in the wing-back chair by the window, still wearing the mud-spattered riding clothes from his frantic journey the night before. His impeccable auburn hair was matted, raked through by desperate fingers throughout the long night. His sharp, clean-shaven jaw, usually so smooth and severe, was now dark with the shadow of a sleepless vigil, and his striking light blue eyes were fixed on the river and the estate that lay beyond it. He had ridden to Pembroke Hall to save her. He had ridden there to confess a decade of love. But the words of the Earl of Harrowcroft were still echoing in the empty room like a curse. She accepted. She knows. She did it with her eyes wide open. That was the knife that twisted in his gut. Albinus could handle rejection. He could handle her hatred. He deserved that. But the thought that Henrietta, the girl he had raised, the woman whose soul he thought he knew better than his own, had looked at the evidence of Felix's fraud and chosen him anyway. That broke him. It meant she was so desperate to escape the loneliness Albinus had created that she would knowingly shackle herself to a liar just to get away from him. He stood up, his limbs stiff, and walked to the mirror. He looked at the reflection of the Duke of Ellingford. For 6 years, he had played the villain to protect her virtue. Now, looking at the hollowed-out man in the glass, he realized he had succeeded too well. He wasn't a guardian anymore. He was just a ghost haunting the edges of a life she was trying to rebuild. The reading of the band's St. Jude's Parish Church, Sunday morning. If there is a hell on earth, Albinus discovered it is a Sunday morning service in a small country parish when the woman you love is sitting across the aisle with another man. The church was packed. The air smelled of damp wool, beeswax, and the suffocating scent of lilies. Albinus sat in the private Pilkington family pew, his back rigid, his face a mask of indifferent stone. He forced himself to look forward, to focus on the stained glass depicting the martyrs, but every nerve in his body was hyper-aware of the Pembroke pew to his left. Henrietta sat there, dressed in pale blue, the colour she used to wear when they rode the boundaries of their estates together. She looked beautiful, but fragile. Her cheekbones seemed sharper than he remembered, her skin paler, as if the engagement had drained the blood from her face. Beside her sat Felix, looking every inch the proud fiancé. His arm was draped along the back of the pew, his fingers inches from her shoulder, claiming her for the entire county to see. The vicar cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. The rustling of the congregation ceased. I publish the banns of marriage between Felix, Earl of Harrowcroft, and Lady Henrietta Pembroke of this parish. The words hung in the air, final and suffocating. The congregation murmured their approval. Heads turned to smile at the happy couple. Albinus didn't move. He didn't blink. He felt Henry Ashcombe's gaze burning into the side of his head from the next pew, urging him to do something, to stand up, to object, to scream. But he couldn't. She knows, he told himself, the thought acting like a chain around his throat. She chose him. To object now would be the final insult. It would be the jealous ranting of the guardian who couldn't let go of his ward. Across the aisle, Henrietta stared at her hands, twisting the fabric of her gloves. She wasn't listening to the vicar. She was waiting. Every muscle in her body was coiled tight, waiting for a sound from the Pilkington pew. Stand up, she begged silently. Look at me. Be angry. Be anything other than this statue. She risked a glance across the aisle. She saw Albinus's profile, that sharp, devastating jawline, the cool blue eyes staring straight ahead at the altar. He looked bored. He looked like he was thinking about crop yields or tenant rents. Her heart shattered all over again. Kitty was right, she thought, the tears pricking her eyes, forcing her to look away. He doesn't care. He is relieved. He is finally free of the burden. The rain, the village high street, 3 days later. The engagement moved forward with the relentless grinding speed of a train leaving the station. The village was buzzing with talk of the wedding breakfast, the trousseau, the merging of the Pembroke fortune with the Harrowcroft title. Albinus tried to imprison himself at Pilkington House, but duty was a cruel master. He was forced into the village to meet with his solicitor regarding the harvest. As he exited the dusty office, stepping out into the relentless autumn rain, he froze. Henrietta was stepping out of the milliner's shop, clutching a hat box to her chest to shield it from the drizzle. She was alone, for once without Felix hovering over her like a vulture. They stopped. The street was empty save for a passing cart filled with apples. The rain drummed against the cobblestones, creating a wall of noise around them, isolating them in a grey, wet world. They were 10 feet apart, the closest they had been since she screamed at him in her library. Albinus felt the physical pull of her like gravity. It took every ounce of his willpower not to cross the stones, grab her shoulders, and shake her. He wanted to ask, why? Why him? Why a fraud? Why did you look at the evidence I brought you and decide it didn't matter? Henrietta looked at him, her dark eyes wide and startled, raindrops catching in her lashes. She waited for him to speak. She waited for the congratulations. She waited for the lecture. She waited for anything that proved he was still the Albinus who had once promised to protect her. Albinus opened his mouth. The words were there, burning his tongue. Do not do this. Come home. But then he saw the ring. On her left hand, glinting dully in the grey light, was a heavy sapphire. It wasn't a Pembroke heirloom, it was Felix's claim. It was the shackle she had accepted. The image of Felix on the steps flashed in his mind. She accepted with her eyes wide open. Albinus closed his mouth. He adjusted his stance, tipping his hat, a stiff, formal, polite gesture that cut deeper than a slap. "Lady Henrietta," he said, his voice devoid of emotion, smooth and cold as marble. "I trust the preparations are proceeding well." Henrietta flinched, the colour drained from her face. Of all the things he could have said, anger, sadness, joy, polite indifference was the cruelest weapon he possessed. It erased their history. It reduced her to a neighbour he barely knew. "They are proceeding perfectly, Your Grace," she lied, her voice trembling, her chin lifting in a defiant attempt at dignity. "I have never been happier." "Then I wish you joy," Albinus lied back. He walked past her to his horse. He mounted and rode away without looking back, terrified that if he turned around, he would fall apart right there in the street. He didn't see her drop the hat box in the mud. He didn't see her press her gloved hand to her mouth to stifle a sob that sounded like a heart breaking. Pilkington House. 2 nights before the wedding. The silence in Pilkington House was no longer a sanctuary, it was a tomb. Albinus sat in his library, the same room where he had rejected her in the white dress 6 years ago, the same room where he had confessed to Henry. The brandy bottle on the desk was empty. He had spent the last week telling himself it was for the best. He had told himself that if she wanted Felix, she should have him. He had tried to respect her choice, to be the noble guardian one last time. But he couldn't breathe. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face in the rain. He saw the tremble in her lip when she said she was happy. She didn't look happy, a voice whispered in his head. She looked terrified. And then a darker thought took root. A thought that had been gnawing at him since the encounter on the steps, fighting through the haze of his self-pity. What if Felix lied? Albinus sat up straighter. Felix was a gambler. Felix was a fraud who had lied to banks, to creditors, to society. Why would he tell the truth to his rival? "You had her all her life. She told me everything." Yes, Felix knew the history. But did Henrietta know the truth about the debts? Felix said she did. Felix said she accepted with eyes wide open. But would Henrietta, the girl who valued honesty above all else, truly marry a man who had lied to the world just to spite Albinus? Or did she still not know? What if Felix had charmed her, isolated her, and told her that the Duke's evidence was just a jealous lie? What if she thinks Albinus abandoned her to the wolves without a fight? Albinus stood up. The heavy oak chair scraped loudly against the floor. He walked to the window. The lights of Pembroke Hall were blazing across the river. They were hosting the pre-wedding dinner tonight. The entire county would be there. Felix would be there, toasting his good fortune, drinking Pembroke wine, touching Henrietta with hands that hadn't earned her. Albinus looked at his reflection in the dark glass. The auburn hair was grey at the temples from the stress of the week. The blue eyes were haunted, ringed with exhaustion. He had spent 6 years being noble. He had spent 6 years respecting boundaries. And where had it gotten him? Alone in the dark, watching the woman he loved prepare to marry a monster. "To hell with nobility," he whispered to the empty room. He didn't care if she knew. He didn't care if she chose him. He didn't care if he caused a scandal that would be talked about for a century. He was not going to let her marry a fraud without looking her in the eye one last time. He was going to ask her himself, and if she told him to his face that she loved Felix, he would leave. But he would not take the word of a liar. He turned and walked out of the library. He didn't run this time. He walked with the terrifying, lethal calm of a man who has absolutely nothing left to lose. He was going to the dinner, and he wasn't leaving without the truth. The dining room, Pembroke Hall, 8 p.m. The pre-wedding dinner was a suffocating affair of crystal, candlelight, and lies. 20 of the county's most influential aristocrats sat around the long mahogany table at Pembroke Hall, dining on pheasant and drinking vintage wine, toasting to the union of the Pembroke fortune and the Harrowcroft title. Henrietta sat at the center of it all, a beautiful frozen doll in sapphire silk. She smiled when she was spoken to. She laughed when Felix told a joke. But underneath the table, her hands were twisting her napkin into a tight white rope. She felt sick. Every time Felix touched her hand, she felt a wave of nausea. Every time a guest congratulated her on her match, she felt the trap closing tighter. Felix stood up, tapping his silver spoon against his glass. The sharp ting-ting-ting cut through the chatter. The room fell silent. He looked handsome, triumphant, and utterly fraudulent. "My lords, ladies," Felix began, his voice smooth as oil, commanding the attention of the table, "I invite you to charge your glasses." He waited while the guests reached for their crystal, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. He looked down at Henrietta, like a man admiring a piece of property he had just acquired for a steal. "I give you, Lady Henrietta," Felix announced, raising his glass high, "who saw past my humble circumstances and chose love." A ripple of polite laughter went around the table. Henrietta stared at her wine, trying not to scream. Humble circumstances. He had told her his estates were merely under renovation. He had told her the Duke approved of the match. He had told her that Albinus was relieved to have her settled. Felix beamed. "To Henrietta!" "To Henrietta!" the guests chorused, raising their glasses. The heavy double doors of the dining room slammed open. The sound was like a cannon shot. Every head turned. The toast died in the air. Albinus stood in the doorway. He was not dressed for dinner. He was wearing the same dark riding coat he had worn in the library, unbuttoned and disheveled. His impeccable auburn hair was wind-blown, his sharp, clean-shaven jaw was dark with stubble, and his chest was heaving as if he had run the entire distance from Pilkington House. But it was his eyes, those striking, light blue eyes, that silenced the room. They were burning with a cold blue fire that pinned Felix to the wall. He looked like a fallen angel who had crawled out of hell to crash a party. "Your Grace?" Kitty Farewell gasped from the end of the table, her hand flying to her mouth. Albinus didn't look at her. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't apologize for the intrusion. He walked into the room, his boots thudding heavily on the parquet floor, heading straight for the head of the table. Felix lowered his glass, his smile tightening into a sneer. "Duke," he said, trying to salvage the moment with arrogance, "we didn't expect you. Have you come to finally drink to our happiness?" Albinus ignored him entirely. He stopped directly behind Henrietta's chair. The proximity of him, the scent of rain, brandy, and fury, made her heart stop. "Did you know?" Albinus asked. His voice was low, vibrating through the silent room, directed only at her. Henrietta turned in her chair, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. "Albinus! What are you doing?" "Answer me," Albinus commanded, his hands gripping the back of her chair so hard the wood groaned. "Did you know about the debts? Harrowcroft told me you accepted him with your eyes wide open. He told me you knew he was bankrupt and you chose him anyway." The room gasped. A fork clattered onto a plate. The word bankrupt hung in the air like poison. Felix moved fast. "He is drunk!" Felix shouted, signaling to the footman. "Get him out of here! The Duke is unwell!" "I am perfectly well," Albinus roared, spinning on Felix, his voice shaking the crystal on the table. "And I am done with your lies, Harrowcroft." He turned back to Henrietta, his blue eyes searching hers, desperate and wild. "He told me on the steps that you knew everything. He said you chose a fraud because you were desperate. Is it true, Henrietta? Did you look at the evidence I brought you and decide it didn't matter?" Henrietta stood up, her chair scraping back against the floor. Her face was white with shock. "Evidence," she whispered. "What evidence? You brought me papers, Albinus, but you didn't let me read them. You threw them on the table and forbade me like a child, and then—" She looked at Felix, confusion warring with horror. "Felix told me those papers were just the financial settlements. He told me you were angry because you were trying to control my trust." She turned to Felix, her voice rising with accusation. "You told me the Duke gave his blessing," she accused. "You told me Albinus was relieved to finally see me married so he could be done with the burden of watching over me." Albinus felt the world tilt back on its axis. She didn't know. Felix had lied. He had played them both against each other. He had told Albinus she knew about the debts to make him give up. He had told Henrietta that Albinus was happy to get rid of her to make her say yes. "He lied," Albinus breathed, the relief crashing into him so hard he nearly staggered. "Henrietta, he is destitute. He has mortgaged everything. He is marrying you for your money." "That is enough!" Felix lunged forward, grabbing Albinus's arm. Albinus didn't even look at him. He shoved the Earl backward with a force that sent Felix crashing into a serving table, sending a tureen of soup shattering to the floor. The room erupted into chaos. Ladies screamed, men stood up. But Albinus and Henrietta were in a bubble of silence, staring only at each other. "Why do you care?" Henrietta screamed, the tears finally spilling over. She didn't care about the guests. She didn't care about the scandal. "Why do you care if he steals my money? You haven't cared about me for 6 years." "I cared every day," Albinus shouted back, the dam finally breaking. "I have bled for 6 years." "You ignored me," she sobbed, hitting his chest with her fists. "You looked through me. You treated me like a stranger in my own home. You made me feel ugly and unwanted and burdensome." Albinus caught her wrists. He pulled her close, ignoring the gasp of the crowd, ignoring the ruin of his reputation. "I didn't ignore you because you were ugly," he rasped, his voice breaking into 1,000 pieces. "I ignored you because you were the most beautiful thing I had ever seen, and it terrified me." The silence that fell over the room was absolute. Even Felix, struggling to his feet, froze. "I was your guardian," Albinus whispered, the truth pouring out of him like blood from a wound. "You were 18. You walked into my library in that white silk dress, and I stopped breathing." Henrietta stared at him, her lips parted, the tears stopping on her cheeks. "The debut gown." "The debut gown," Albinus confirmed, his eyes burning into hers. "I looked at you, and I didn't see a ward. I saw the only woman I would ever want, and I hated myself for it." He let go of her wrists to cup her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "I thought I was a predator, Henrietta. I thought if I touched you, I would corrupt you. I thought if I showed you even an ounce of what I was feeling, I would be betraying your father." He laughed, a wet, self-deprecating sound. "So, I became the villain. I built a wall of ice. I pushed you away to keep you safe from me. I stood at my window every night for 6 years and watched your lights, telling myself I was being noble." He leaned his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. "I was a fool. I didn't save you. I just broke both our hearts and left the door open for a liar to walk in." He pulled back, looking deep into her dark eyes. "I am not here as your guardian, Henrietta. I am not here as your neighbor. I am here as a man who has loved you since the moment you grew up, and who has hated himself every day for letting you go." Albinus straightened up, turning to look at the room. He looked at the shocked guests. He looked at Kitty Farewell, who was weeping openly into her napkin with a smile on her face. And finally, he looked at Felix, who was standing by the ruined table, wiping soup from his coat, looking small and defeated. "The engagement is over," Albinus declared, his voice ringing with the authority of the Duke of Ellingford. "Get out of her house, Harrowcroft, before I call the magistrate." Felix looked at Henrietta. He saw the way she was looking at Albinus, as if the sun had just come out after a 6-year winter. He knew when he was beaten. Felix straightened his coat, shot a venomous look at the couple, and stormed out of the room without a word. Albinus turned back to Henrietta. The anger was gone. The adrenaline was fading, leaving him exposed and vulnerable in front of half the county. "I cannot make you choose me," he whispered, his hands dropping to his sides. "I have treated you poorly. I have wasted your time. If you want me to leave, Henrietta, if you want me to go back to Pilkington House and never speak to you again, say the word, and I will go." He waited. The entire room waited. Henrietta stood there, trembling, looking at the man who had just destroyed her wedding dinner, ruined her reputation, and saved her life. The dining room, Pembroke Hall. Moments later. The heavy double doors slammed shut behind Felix, the sound echoing like a gunshot that signaled the end of the war. The dining room was dead silent. The guests, 20 of the most influential people in the county, sat frozen among the ruins of the dinner. A silver tureen of soup lay overturned on the Persian rug, staining the wool dark. Crystal goblets lay shattered on the tablecloth. The scandal of the decade had just played out in front of their eyes. A duke brawling with an earl, an engagement broken, and a secret love confessed at the top of a screaming match. Henrietta stood by the head of the table, her chest heaving, tears still wet on her cheeks. She felt exposed. She felt raw. She looked at the shocked faces of her neighbours, realising that by tomorrow this night would be whispered about in every drawing room in London. Albinus stood a few feet away, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The adrenaline of the fight was fading, replaced by a terrifying clarity. He looked at Kitty Farewell, who sat at the end of the table, blotting her eyes with a napkin and offering him a small, teary nod of encouragement. Albinus straightened his ruined coat. He ran a hand through his dishevelled auburn hair, trying to summon the dignity of the Duke of Ellingford one last time. He turned to the table, his voice hoarse but steady. "My lords, ladies," Albinus said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "I apologize for the disruption. Please, finish your wine, but I believe Lady Henrietta and I require some air." He didn't wait for permission. He didn't offer his arm with the stiff formality of a neighbour. He simply reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and offered his palm. Henrietta looked at it. It was the hand that had pulled her from the carriage when she was 9. It was the hand that had pushed her away when she was 18. And now it was the hand that had fought for her. She took it. Her skin was cold. His was burning. Together, they walked out of the room, leaving the whispers of society behind them. The garden, the terrace of Pembroke Hall, night. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the garden smelling of wet earth, old stone, and roses. The moon was fighting its way through the heavy clouds, casting a silver light over the wet flagstones of the terrace. They walked to the stone balustrade, the very spot where they used to play tag as children, a lifetime ago. Albinus let go of her hand immediately, gripping the rough stone railing instead, his knuckles turning white. He was afraid that if he touched her for 1 second longer without knowing her answer, he would shatter. He looked out at the dark river that separated their lands. For 6 years, this view had been his torture. He had stood at his window across the water, watching her lights, imagining her life. Now, standing beside her, the silence wasn't empty. It was heavy with everything they hadn't said. "I ruined your dinner," Albinus said quietly, his voice rough. Henrietta let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. She leaned against the balustrade, looking at his profile, the sharp, clean-shaven jaw, the straight nose, the lashes that shadowed his eyes. "You ruined my life, Albinus. The dinner is the least of my concerns." He flinched, as if she had struck him. He turned to face her, his expression open and agonizingly vulnerable. "I know," he whispered. "I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. I wasted 6 years. I made you feel unloved. I let you walk into the arms of a man like Felix because I was too cowardly to claim you myself." He looked at her, really looked at her, taking in the pale blue silk of her dress, the darkness of her eyes, the way the moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks. "But I meant what I said in there," he continued, his voice dropping to a rough, intimate murmur. I didn't ignore you because I didn't care. I ignored you because I loved you too much to be in the same room with you." He took a step closer, the magnetic pull between them undeniable. "I was your guardian. I thought I had to be perfect. I thought I had to be the stone wall that protected you. I didn't realize that the only thing I was protecting you from was my own heart." Henrietta looked up at him. For 6 years, she had seen only the Duke, the cold, distant, perfect statue who judged her from a distance. Tonight, she saw the man. She saw the stubble on his jaw. She saw the mud on his boots. She saw the desperation in his striking light blue eyes. "You were never a statue to me, Albinus," she whispered. "You were just the man who wouldn't look at me." She reached out, her fingers hovering over the lapel of his ruined coat. "I didn't choose Felix because I loved him. I chose him because he offered me a home. I was so tired of being alone in this big house. I was so tired of waiting for you to remember me." "I never forgot you," Albinus swore, covering her hand with his own, pressing it against his chest so she could feel the frantic rhythm of his heart. "Not for a single hour. You were the first thing I thought of when I woke, and the last thing I thought of before I slept." The silence wasn't empty, Henrietta. It was full of you. He took a deep breath, the stakes higher than they had ever been. "I am not your guardian anymore," he said firmly. "That contract ended years ago, and I am not your neighbor. I am just a man who is terrified that he is 10 minutes too late." He stepped back and did something the Duke of Ellingford never did. He got down on one knee. He didn't care about the mud ruining his trousers. He didn't care about the wet stone. He looked up at her, his expression open, vulnerable, and completely honest. "I cannot offer you a title you don't already have," he said softly. "I cannot offer you fortune. You have your own. But I can offer you a promise." He squeezed her hand. "I promise that I will never be cold to you again. I promise that I will never walk out of a room when you enter it. I promise that for the rest of my life, I will spend every single day making up for the 6 years I stole from us." He paused, his voice cracking under the weight of his emotion. "Henrietta, will you save me?" The wind rustled the wet leaves in the garden. Inside the house, 20 guests were undoubtedly pressing their faces against the glass, holding their breath. Henrietta looked down at him. She looked at the man who had raised her, the man who had broken her heart, and the man who had just fought a war to get her back. She didn't smile. This wasn't a moment for smiles. It was too heavy, too important. Instead, she dropped to her knees in front of him, ruining her sapphire silk dress on the wet stones so she could be eye level with him. "You foolish man," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You didn't have to fight Felix. You didn't have to break down the door." She reached out and cupped his face, her thumbs tracing the sharp line of his jaw, feeling the tension finally leaving his body. "You just had to ask." Albinus let out a shuddering breath, burying his face in her palm for a split second before he surged forward. He kissed her. It wasn't a polite Regency peck. It was a kiss 6 years in the making, desperate, hungry, and full of all the words they hadn't said. It tasted of rain and brandy and relief. It was the end of the silence and the beginning of everything else. The epilogue, St. Jude's Parish Church, the following spring. The wedding of the Duke of Ellingford and Lady Henrietta Pembroke was not the quiet, dutiful affair the Dowager Duchess might have planned a decade ago. It was the event of the season. The church was packed to the rafters. The air smelled of lilies and beeswax. The same vicar who had read the banns for Felix now stood ready to unite the true couple. As Henrietta walked down the aisle, the whispers weren't about scandal. They were about the way the Duke looked at her. Albinus stood at the altar. He was impeccable once more, wearing a morning coat of dark charcoal, his auburn hair perfectly styled with its deep side part. But the coldness was gone. The statue had crumbled. When he saw her appear in the doorway, he didn't stiffen. He didn't look away. He smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile that lit up his entire face, softening his sharp features and making his light blue eyes shine with a warmth the congregation had never seen. He watched her walk toward him, step by step, closing the distance he had once fought so hard to keep. He had spent years ignoring her to protect her. He would spend the rest of his life showing her exactly how much he loved her.